Just what is it about sequels that get fans of a particular game excited? Maybe it's the prospect of additional features added to the game, or new mechanics. Or perhaps it's the inclusion of new characters or new stories. For me, video game sequels serve as a way for developers to not just improve the gameplay, but also fix the various problems associated with the first game. For this video, I wanted to cover some video game sequels that were generally better than their predecessors. That isn't to say that the original games were bad in any way, rather they served as the blueprint for developers to go back to the drawing board and set new goals in designing a quality title. Before we get started, make sure you hit that subscribe button. The Smoking Fiend Productions. The Ratchet Clank series is probably one of the most beloved Sony IPs out there, right next to Metal Gear or God of War. Already this series has over 10 games stretching across multiple consoles from the PlayStation 2 all the way to the PS5. What exactly made this series great and worth playing? Perhaps it was the wonderfully designed levels which encouraged exploration, or the plethora of weapons to switch between, or maybe the funny double entendres the game is known for.
Of multiple enemies, then fire them out as high-caliber missiles. Caution, enemies must be small enough to fit inside the barrel.
Sweet! I bet Captain Quark uses stuff like this all the time.
Ha! Real men can swing without silly toys like that!
Out of all these games, I would argue that the best one was in fact the second game in the series, Ratchet Clank Going Commando. Besides being one of the most successful games on the PlayStation 2, it was also one of the greatest sequels ever made, and overall kind of exemplifies how a sequel for a popular video game should be designed. The first Ratchet & Clank released for the PlayStation 2 in 2002 by Insomniac Games introduced the cat-like creature Ratchet and his robot sidekick Clank as the newest platforming mascots for Sony Entertainment. The third-person action game had you transversing across the galaxy, blasting your way through multitudes of different enemies using weapons and gadgets purchased throughout the game. It was probably the first platformer which allowed players to use many different weapons and gadgets, much less giving players the option to switch those weapons and gadgets at will. Along with offering plenty of weapons and gadgets, Insomniac also gave players ways to utilize Clank in traversing levels and difficult terrains. Most platformers at the time simply placed you in a level with one singular objective, but Ratchet & Clank there was about 3 to 4 different objectives for each planet you landed on. And on each planet you had different ways to earn money to purchase the new weapons the game's fictional weapons company Gadgetron had to offer. I would love to say that Ratchet & Clank was the perfect game when it came out in 2002, but let's face it, anyone replaying the original game on the PlayStation 2 will notice how unnecessarily difficult the game actually is, and it mostly stems from the terrible camera angles. In situations where you have multiple enemies firing multiple directions or swarming at multiple directions, it's almost impossible to align your target right. In most cases, you have to pray and spray your weapons, meaning that you just end up firing in multiple directions. And most of the time you will hit something, but you also run the risk of wasting ammo. And yeah, you can find ammo around the levels or by killing enemies, but depending on what you need to get past a certain area, you might find yourself walking back and forth between Gadgetron vending machines and spending more bolts up. And in the long term, you really don't want to spend all your bolts up, because you won't be able to afford the more expensive weapons offered on later planets. I love this game to this day, but this was a serious problem that the game suffered from. Not just for the fact that you wasted ammo, but because it would be the cost of cheap deaths as well. Ratchet could only take about 4 hits before he died. And once you die, you basically have to start from the last vending machine you visited. Regardless of this serious issue, the game is still worth playing. I would just maybe play the remastered version on the PS4 if you could though. 1 year later, Insomniac Games was back again with a follow-up, Ratchet & Clank Going Commando. This was Ratchet & Clank on overdrive. To meet the development needs, the studio had to double overnight, going from 40 to 80 members. If you needed a reason by 2003 to finally get a PlayStation 2, well, here it was. And if you were a fan of the original game like I was, you notice how much an improvement the gameplay was. The The most significant improvement in Ratchet & Clank Going Commando is the strafing mechanic. It doesn't quite fix the camera issue, but it does make it so you can target enemies at a more consistent rate. And the strafing mechanic made it so you no longer need to spray and pray. You simply just let the auto targeting do its job. With the strafing mechanic, you can also control Ratchet more intuitively by having him perform side jumps and backflips to avoid enemy fire. This style of control will be featured in pretty much every game from this point forward. Discussing the gameplay further, one major component added was the arena combat stages. This served to win bolts along with leveling up Ratchet and his weapons. These arena battles can get intense and they force the player to really strategize on what weapons to use and when. Another detail which I find makes the gameplay better is the pause in between switching weapons. Since I could never remember which weapons I placed in my quick selection boxes, it was hard to find the right weapon for the right job. It's not the case here, as there's a small window of time that helps you think more about the weapons you want to choose. The biggest and most important detail added to Going Commando was the ability to upgrade weapons and Ratchet. Over time, the more enemies you destroy, Ratchet can increase his health to take more and more hits, thus making cheap deaths less likely. Also, upgrading your arsenal is one of the best things Insomniac could have accomplished in the weapons-based game. I mean, the arsenal of weapons you're given alone was impressive, but with the added level ups and weapons mods, you can really have a ball. Another cool feature related to the weapons was the ability to buy previous Gadgetron weapons used from the first game, as opposed to just buying the Megacorp weapons. If you did get this game in 2003 when it came out, more than likely you would have had your previous saves from the first Ratchet & Clank on your memory card, and thus you're able to get free weapons from the previous game, depending if you purchased them in the previous game or not. Ratchet & Clank Going Commando is without doubt one of the greatest sequels ever. Not only did it add tremendously to the gameplay, but it also improved it considerably, and it would establish how the rest of the series would be developed and designed going forward. When thinking about violent video games, let's just forget about the GTAs, Saints Rows, and Call of Duties. Instead, let's take it back to one of Rockstar Games' most controversial IPs. Get ready for a Manhunt. Sneaking about and performing gory executions, all at the command of a sick and twisted director. This is basically what you did in Manhunt, released for the PlayStation 2 and Xbox and PC between 2003 and 2004, and developed by Rockstar North, a company who, while playing damage control for the controversial release of GTA 3, were very much reluctant to actually make this game. And about 15 minutes into playing, well, you'll see why. Manhunt is probably one of, if not one of the most sadistic and depraved games ever released. But that's not exactly what made the game good. I mean, sure, pulling off executions was a big part. It was basically how you were ranked in the game. But the real fun was in surviving and planning how you would take down your pursuers. In most cases, I would just make noises to attract attackers. But there were times where I would sneak around and catch them off guard. And the attackers or stalkers in the game were pretty diverse. In total, there were about 5 different gangs you had to contend with, who all had their own voice lines where they would scream taunts and insults at you. Manhunt lacked any real sufficient story. Instead, you just played as James Earl Cash, a death row inmate who was stuck in a sick, snuck film for a deranged director who commented every time he performed a kill. It almost seems like this game was over the top in violence for the sake of being over the top in violence. And that was okay. As with companies like Rockstar, who are always pushing the boundaries of what could be depicted in a video game, it really set the trend for more violent action games in the future. But replaying the game to this day, the main issue that I constantly encounter is the super dark levels. Some of these, particularly like the junkyard, can get annoying to actually traverse. If you're playing on the PS2, you will need to set your screen brightness way up past the recommended level. Another issue which the game suffers from is the poor AI of the NPCs. The stalkers in Manhunt can be inconsistent in detecting you. Sometimes they will spot you easily enough walking around, but in some cases they will run right past you without a care. These factors weren't enough to deter me from Manhunt. To this day, I still find the game to be a classic, but the sequel, Manhunt 2, would prove to be much more engaging. As controversial as the release of Manhunt was, Rockstar and Take-Two felt the blowback from Manhunt 2 even more. If you want to learn more about the controversy behind Manhunt 2, you should definitely check out my smoky review of the game on this channel. Released in 2007, 4 years after the original game, Manhunt 2 revolved around the escape of a mental patient, Daniel Lamb, who was fleeing the secret organization known as the Project, all while trying to reclaim his past. Throughout the span of the game, Daniel and his accomplice, Leo Casper, are pursued relentlessly by Project agents and authorities. Just like in Manhunt, you did your best to survive levels where you're being hunted by attackers, along with performing executions. In this game, Rockstar took the executions to a new extreme. Their initial plans for the game were to have players perform the actual movements of the executions while performing them. This was the initial plan for the PC and Nintendo Wii version, along with the PSP version as well. Well, not too many people were thrilled about this. In fact, Rockstar was forced to push back their initial release in order to make cuts to the console versions of the game. If you were lucky enough to have the PC version, then you'll see firsthand what was cut out, literally. Manhunt was known for its grim level of executions, but the ones in the sequel, well, they were just grim. I mean really grim. With a wide variety of melee weapons and tools, Rockstar programmed various commands for the players to move their mouse while carrying out kills. And unlike the first game, the kills are not disoriented with a grainy static camera. Rather, they were blatant and in your face. To me, this made it much more satisfying to pull off an execution. Killing aside, there are plenty of other reasons to like Manhunt 2. The enemy AI is much more improved, as stalkers can now look into shaded areas. And this worked to add a layer of suspense in the game, as stalkers could now pull you out of the shadow and beat you down if you did not follow the proper mouse command. Manhunt 2 also just looks better. The scenery and the levels are both disturbing and visually pleasing. They feature plenty of potential hiding spaces along with environmental executions as well. It was only recently I really played the PC version, so growing up the only version of this game I really had access to was the PlayStation 2 version, which was kinda good. Only thing is, like I said earlier, Rockstar had to cut out a lot of content, so it wasn't nearly as good as the PC version. If you had asked me a year ago which Manhunt I believe is better, I would have said the first game. But after playing the PC version all the way through, it's hard not to conclude that Manhunt 2 was the better game. Not only did the gameplay improve and evolve, but Rockstar also added a more engaging story. You're not just killing for the sake of killing, but you're killing to survive and reach a goal. There weren't many Star Wars games I played growing up other than the brief Battlefront series. This third-person action shooter was developed by Pandemic Games and published by LucasArts in 2004. This was a game that even the most casual of Star Wars fans could enjoy back then. The point of the game was to run around, shoot lasers and explosives, and capture enemy respawn points. You would either capture all the respawn points, or deplete the enemy reinforcements. Battlefront was created at a time when third-person shooters were a dime a dozen, and when the series was getting a resurgence of new interest, particularly with the release of the Star Wars trilogy to DVD. Battlefront had plenty to offer in terms of a licensed video game. It featured 2 campaigns set in either the Clone Wars or Galactic Civil War. It also featured a Galactic Conquest mode, where as the name implies, you conquer planets across the galaxy for either the Imperial or Rebel forces. For each side, you have around 5 different classes to choose from. Each class, whether they be infantry, heavy weapons, or snipers, move relatively the same. Your character moves in the strike position with a cursor on the screen. You fire with the R1 and dodge by maneuvering the analog stick with X. In between dodging, you can toss grenades when you see multiple enemies, and while firing, you have to keep an eye out for medical droids and resupply stations. These can be found by your respawn point, which is more of a reason why you have to keep these protected while at the same time advancing into enemy territory. Regardless of the little shortcomings, this game is pretty awesome. What makes the Battlefront series awesome is that it offered fans a new way to experience the Star Wars universe. Deciding to center the action around the view of a frontline rebel or stormtrooper was cool and exciting at the time. And if you had the PC version, you got to play online with others. To this day, people are still designing maps for the PC version of the game. Honestly, I have nothing negative to say about Battlefront. It was a great game regardless of what system you played it on. But I guess some people might find fault with the AI in the single player campaign. Yeah, it's not the best, and makes the single campaign kinda easy. But other than that, Battlefront is just a good Star Wars game and a decent third-person shooter. The quality of this licensed game was good enough to convince plenty of Star Wars fans to grab the copy of Battlefront II.
On November 1st, prepare yourself for the sequel to the best-selling Star Wars game of all time.
Released in 2005, the game offered us new vehicles, new maps, and new missions. Coming out in 2005, the same year that Revenge of the Sith hit the theaters, Pandemic was able to include the full Star Wars narrative within the campaign Rise of the Empire. This campaign featured a whopping 18 missions along with 4 space missions. Throughout the single-player campaign, you're taken through the events of all 6 films through the perspective of a clone trooper from the 501st Legion. Now, I wasn't the biggest fan of the new Star Wars films, but it was still entertaining to hear how the Jedi Order was betrayed and how the Republic grew to be an empire.
Star Wars Battlefront II, the game that lets you fight all the classic.
Just like the first game, Battlefront included all locations from the movie and then some. Levels are much bigger and feature different objectives depending on what mode you're playing on. Gameplay wise, Battlefront had a few small improvements from the first game. You get a total of 5 different classes of soldiers to use in the battles. You also have a convenient sprint button that comes in handy for invading enemies. And like I said earlier, there are objectives in the campaign mode that you play out. These range from destroying enemy shields to retrieving important information. The real selling point for this game would have been the online multiplayer. I remember putting in a lot of hours in the online mode, and for good reason. It was just sheer, endless fun battling on multiple fronts across various planets featured in the film. As far as sequels go, Battlefront 2 is definitely in my top tier. I mean, the first Battlefront itself was already a great game, and honestly, Pandemic didn't have to add in as much as they did. No doubt the Battlefront series, and I mean the Pandemic Battlefront series, is a love letter to die-hard and casual fans alike of Star Wars. If you get a chance, make sure you play these games, as they are entertaining and have plenty of Star Wars content. Warhammer The End Times is a cooperative first-person survival video game developed and released by Fat Shark in 2015. This game is set in the Warhammer fantasy universe during an apocalyptic event known as The End Times. The objective is to beat back the rodent-like rat race known as the Skaven, which are basically rat men from the underground who want to overthrow and destroy the human race. That's about as much as I'll get into regarding the setting. I won't dare touch on any of the story or setting related to the Warhammer fantasy world, as it would be way too extensive. If you're a fan of games like Left 4 Dead, this game will feel right at home. You get a selection of 5 different heroes to choose from and play cooperatively online. Of course, nowadays you'll have a hard time finding anyone to play with, as the online lobbies are pretty much empty. But regardless, single player is still fun. Warhammer End Times also allows you to level up your characters the more you use them on missions, along with gaining new abilities for your characters as well. Over time, you also unlock and forge new weapons, along with upgrading those weapons themselves. If you're too intimidated by the sheer scale of the Warhammer universe like me, this is a good game to introduce yourself to it, as the more you play, the more secrets and lore you unlock regarding the world itself. So, getting back to the gameplay, you can choose between 5 different characters who have different skills. You can play as an Empire soldier, a Wood Elf, or a Dwarf or Wizard. Personally, I enjoy playing as the Witch Hunter Captain, Victor Southspire, since he uses dual pistols and a rapier sword. You can switch back and forth between melee and projectile weapons within the game. Now, this game looks pretty easy, but trust me, you have to be on your guard at pretty much every second. Just one wrong step could end in an ambush that can devastate your party. This game really forces you to keep an eye out for the different enemy types. Most of the regular ones are easy, but every now and so often you get the heavy armored rat men who take forever to kill. You also have to look out for the Gatling rats, who carry huge Gatling guns that upon being fired can stun a party. The real deadly enemies are the large rat ogres. They are big and can drain your health the fastest with devastating blows. While playing, you have to constantly time your parry blocks in order to avoid taking damage, as one hit could drain your health by a quarter. Graphics wise, this game looks great, even in 2023. The simplified combat combined with the horrific gore and carnage makes for a great time. And by just looking at the level, you can see that there was a lot of detail built into the fictional setting of the town Usarik. Or Usarik? Usarik? I don't know. From the decaying environments or destroyed buildings, this game has plenty to love visually. Of course, this game isn't perfect, as there are some issues with the gameplay. And as I stated earlier, it takes way too long to down the bigger enemies, particularly those armored rats who you have to attack on their head with at least 3 solid strikes before they stop. It gets really annoying hearing your party members tell you this constantly. And of course, you also have those rattling guns. These are the most annoying. It's not just enough to fire an arrow or pistol shot, you have to hit them several times before they drop. In order to get past harder difficulty levels, it's pretty important to level up weapons and trinkets and your character. Most of the time, the upgrades and new weapons unlocked in the game will not correspond with the character you were just using. It takes a lot of grinding in order to advance further on difficult levels. And lastly, the gameplay, well, it can get kinda slow and repetitive. You're mostly killing the same enemies over and over again. But this wasn't enough to keep me from enjoying End Times. I know games like End Times aren't really what I cover on this channel, but I just felt that this particular series of the Warhammer universe doesn't get enough attention from first-person shooter fans, and that's why I chose this last sequel to cover. Released by Fat Shark in 2018, Warhammer Vermintide 2 was a sequel to the original End Times, whereas in the first game you fought solely against the Ratmen known as the Skaven. But here you're also fighting the enemies of chaos, known as the Rotbloods. The game will take you through the area known as Helmgart directly after the events of End Times. For each mission you have a certain objective to complete and must escape to a portal gate at the end of the mission. It retains the 5 heroes used in the previous game, along with granting the player the option to choose different career paths. Among the 5 selectable characters, each has 3 different careers one can choose from. For my favorite characters, Victor Saltzpyre, I can retain him as a witch hunter captain, or change him up to be a bounty hunter, or a holy zealot. Each of these careers comes with their own set of abilities that can be changed throughout the span of the game. More changes to note with Warhammer Vermintide are the improved gameplay and customizable features. This game is fast-paced and relentless. Enemies seem like they spawn out of nowhere, so you really must keep your guard up and constantly check your surroundings and listen out for sound cues. When hordes break out, and they will, it's best to keep your group together so that you can ensure that you're able to revive your party in an instant notice. The combat works generally the same, but with improvements. It doesn't take forever to down larger and more powerful regular enemies. In most cases, a good headshot will drop those armored rats and Gatling gunners. And utilizing your parrying with dodges will keep you from getting down by opponents. I really enjoyed the customization of this game for each character. Each character has access to numerous different melee and projectile weapons. It doesn't take long to build up a large arsenal as it did in the previous one, and you're able to salvage weapons you don't want to build new ones. Additionally, you can also change the traits and provide upgrades for those weapons as well. Yeah, you could do this in the first game, but here it's just generally easier and more satisfying. If you don't know anything about the Warhammer universe or don't even care about the universe, well, it doesn't matter. Anyone can get a kick out of this game. And what's great is that Fat Shark to this day are still making new content for the game. Since its release, the game has already gotten several DLCs and free downloadable content as well, such as the new missions and new careers. You definitely want to try this game out if you haven't, especially if you're someone who loves to play online a lot. I haven't even gone over every single feature this game has to offer in this video, as this video is already long enough. You'll just have to play it yourself to find out. Well, that there is a short list of sequels that were generally better than the predecessors. For development of these games, the developers took inventory of what worked and what didn't work in the previous titles. And as a result, they were able to make not only improvements, but were able to involve the gameplay as well. Well, that concludes this video. Thanks for watching, y'all. This is Bob with Smoking Fiend Productions signing off. Peace out.
Sweet! I bet Captain Quark uses stuff like this all the time.
Ha! Real men can swing without silly toys like that!